Mr. James Rickards is the Senior Managing Director for Market Intelligence at Omnis, an applied research organization. He is also co-head of the firm's practice in threat finance and market intelligence, as well as a member of its board of directors. Mr. Rickards is also an investment banker and risk manager with extensive experience in capital markets, including portfolio and risk management, product structure, financing, and operations. Prior to Omnis, Mr. Rickards held senior executive positions at sell-side firms, which included Citibank and Greenwich Capital Markets, and buy-side firms, including Long-Term Capital Management and Caxton Associates. Mr. Rickards was a direct participant in many significant financial events, and these included the 1981 release of the U.S. hostages in Iran, the 1987 stock market crash, and in the long-term capital management financial crisis of 1998, where he was the principal negotiator of the government-sponsored rescue. He has also been involved in the formation and successful launch of several hedge funds and fund of funds. Mr. Rickards' education includes a Master of Law in Taxation from NYU, a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania, a Master's in International Economics from Johns Hopkins, the School of Advanced International Studies, and a bachelor's degree with honors from Johns Hopkins. Please join me in giving Mr. Rickards a warm welcome.
Duncan, thank you for the introduction. It's truly a privilege to be here tonight in front of a distinguished audience, particularly given our purpose to kind of prepare for the Quadrennial Defense Review. And of course, it's always an honor to speak in front of our men and women in uniform, so I appreciate the opportunity. A couple real simple housekeeping details. We're going to cover a lot of ground tonight. We're probably going to go for about an hour, maybe a little bit less. Then we'll have a half hour of questions. We're going to, as I say, cover a lot of material. We won't be able to get into all of it in great depth, and frankly, a lot of it is relatively new science. So my email address is on the screen. We'll show it again at the end. But I invite any of you to, we'll have questions and answers at the end, but if you'd like more detail on any of this, please send me an email. I'll be happy to get back to you. There is a lot of scientific research behind what I'm going to say tonight. So if I say things that sound either very new or provocative, they're certainly not intentionally provocative, but they may be a little striking in certain ways. I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of research behind this. This is we're going to be talking about market intelligence and really a systems analysis approach, systems dynamics approach to capital markets. A lot of this comes out of physics and applied mathematics and other branches of science. We're bringing it over to the capital markets. It's about 25 years old, but as I say, it's not mainstream, so to speak. So again, if you want footnotes, if you want further references for reading, if you want a fully annotated research, drop me an email. I'll be happy to get all of that for you. Just to kind of amplify the last point, if you happen to find yourself in the faculty lounge at one of our elite universities anytime in the near future, don't repeat anything you hear tonight, because you'll probably get asked to leave. This is not what they teach at Harvard and Chicago, great universities. This is not mainstream economics. It's a new approach, has a very strong foundation. Interestingly, it leads to some very different conclusions. I think it's extremely helpful analytically in terms of thinking about threats, but I don't want to suggest this is what you'll get in your Econ 101 classes. It's a little different than that. With that in mind, why don't we jump in? The first thing I want to do is talk about the difference between finance and economics. We're going to focus on finance as a branch of economics. Economics is a big field. There's macroeconomics, microeconomics, econometrics, banking and money. That's not what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be talking about financial economics in particular, and just to put a finer point on it, capital markets, so stocks, bonds, derivatives, commodities, things of that nature, and how activity in those markets, participants expressing various intentions in those markets, threaten or at least implicate national security. So it's a subset of economics as a whole. Obviously, the economy is critical to national security, as I point out. For many millennia, wealth creation was not very strong, and if you wanted wealth, you basically went out and took it. You invaded the guy next door, took his property, or stole his land, or whatever. That's changed in the last couple hundred years in some ways. Now, we find that instead of power being the path to wealth, wealth is the path to power. We have a very prosperous, strong economy, a lot of technology, a lot of innovation. This is a source of great strength to the United States of America in terms of its military and national security aspects. So there's a clear relationship between the two. You just need to think about the Marshall Plan. We kind of went into Europe after World War II and just outspent the Russians at a time when they didn't have money, and helped prop up Greece and Italy and a few other places to illustrate that. But the opposite is true. If we have financial vulnerabilities, they then become national security vulnerabilities, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So it's not an economics lecture, although we're going to cover a lot of that, but it is focused specifically on capital markets and a particular branch called financial economics. And I'm going to go through some threats and analysis behind it. We're going to divide the threats into two types, sort of exogenous and endogenous, or specific and meta. And the exogenous threats are ones that come from outside the United States. So could it be a sovereign wealth fund, a state rival, a transnational group? You all know the list of suspects there, and we're going to go through some specific cases. But there's an endogenous threat as well. If our financial markets, and I believe we may be in such an episode now, are extremely fragile or extremely weak, we become like a patient with the flu. If an intruder breaks into your house, are you better prepared to deal with that when you're completely healthy or when you have the flu? Well, obviously, it's better to be healthy. Right now, the economy kind of has the flu. Part of my thesis is that it could be a lot worse than that the financial crisis we're in could actually be so severe and so prolonged as to weaken the United States from an economic point of view. And if that's the case, are we then more vulnerable to traditional threats and particularly vulnerable to financial threats? So that's what I mean by the endogenous threat. Again, we'll go through some specific scenarios, but my main point is that the financial threat to national security begins the minute you walk out the door. The minute you leave the room tonight, it's confronting you, because I think the financial crisis we're in is that severe, and we're going to, again, go through that in a lot of detail. So let's jump in. Let me start with some specific threats before we get to the more wide-ranging area. And there are a number of them. Let's just start with the relationship. This is really an illustration of how these things are coming together between Russia and China on the one hand and our friends Fannie and Freddie on the other. And sort of the thesis here is that, if you think of it as a Venn diagram, there's a very large world of national security, defense, and intelligence, professionals, experts, military, et cetera. There's another very large world of capital markets, Wall Street, and from the government side, let's include the Treasury and the Fed. Those two worlds have an intersection, again, in Venn diagram terms. That intersection is growing, and there are threats in that intersection, but it is sparsely populated. The number of experts who have either a foot in both camps, or the number of government agencies that are proactively trying to combine those skill sets to address those threats, are unfortunately very few. And if there's one kind of message I hope you get at the end of the evening, again, we'll go down through this in a lot more detail, is that we need fusion. We need an interdisciplinary approach. I want to see kind of hedge fund people and senior military officials in the same room thinking about these things, because right now those skills are not highly integrated, not well developed on a cross-disciplinary basis. So let's go back to Russia and China. Now, around the 4th of July, we had a crisis in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. There was a crisis of confidence. Secretary Paulson went to the White House and had some remedies. They needed congressional approval. So they went to the Congress, and the Congress acted at warp speed. I mean, people around Washington know that most legislation that's ever introduced doesn't go anywhere, and the stuff that does get passed can take years or longer. Here was legislation that from the time it was introduced, the hearings, final enactment took a matter of a couple weeks. That gives you some sense of the urgency of the crisis. Now, what did the government do? In a typical bailout situation, say in the private sector, you look at a company, you say, all right, look at the assets, look at the liabilities. We have a hole in the balance sheet. So capital is going to get squashed down. We'll wipe out the equity holders. And you debt holders, to the extent there's still a hole in the balance sheet, we're going to haircut that debt. So instead of 100 cents on the dollar, you're going to get 80 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar, or whatever. That's a standard workout. That did not happen in this case. The Treasury and the United States Congress said debt holders are going to get 100 cents on the dollar. Well, there were probably a lot of good reasons for that, but I don't doubt that one of them was the fact that 2 of the 5 largest holders of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are Russia and China. Now, bear in mind this happened in August. Russia had just invaded Georgia. The United States, I don't know if we came to a treaty level, but we certainly reached an agreement with Poland to put intermediate range missiles, missile interceptors in Poland. Russia was threatening the Ukraine. Tensions were ratcheting up. Along comes Fannie Mae. Can you imagine if the United States had imposed a haircut on the debt of Fannie Mae at that time? It's highly likely that Russia would have viewed it as a provocative act, maybe even an act of financial warfare. That's not what we would have intended, but it could easily have been perceived that way. Chinese are even more sensitive. There's an old joke in banking that if I owe you $1 million, I have a problem, but if I owe you $1 billion, you have a problem. Well, we owe the Chinese $1 trillion, so I would say the Chinese have a problem. But they could always change their mind about their willingness to buy U.S. government securities. And if we had whacked those government-sponsored enterprise bonds, the Chinese might have stopped buying our treasury bonds. There could have been all kinds of disruptive effects. I'm not saying any explicit threats were made. That's not my point. My point is these are now considerations that have to be taken into account in the conduct of financial affairs and military and national security affairs. And so these worlds are colliding whether we like it or not. We need to generate that expertise. Let me give you another scenario, again, one familiar to all of you, China-Taiwan. If you were China and you were going to invade Taiwan in 5 years, you'd probably be working on it now. Obviously, it's a massive undertaking with all kinds of implications. So that's something that would start early. All hypothetical, of course, but if China invades Taiwan, highly likely, in my view, that the United States would jump in on the Taiwanese side. We would then be in a war with China. Well, going back to those $1 trillion of U.S. government obligations that China owns, those are not paper certificates. They exist in book entry form. That book entry system is electronic. It's run by the Federal Reserve. One phone call from the president to the Fed, and all those securities would be frozen. The president has that authority already under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Well, if I know it, the Chinese know it too. So thinking, again, in kind of game scenarios, China's going to invade Taiwan. There's a long lead time. They know we'll jump in. They know we'll freeze their securities. What could they be doing today to mitigate the impact of a securities freeze 5 years from now? You can't sell that many securities that quickly. They're kind of stuck with them. Are there hedging strategies? Are there other things they could be investing in, again, that would give them some liquidity? And if so, how would they do that? Would they do it through fronts, through hedge funds, through Swiss banks, et cetera? And then to ask the question is to kind of beg the next question, which is what is the counterintelligence capability of the United States to look for that kind of activity on the part of the Chinese in anticipation of that scenario? I'm not going to answer any of those questions. I want to put those questions out there. I think the people in this room are among those who should be thinking about it. It's typical wargaming or game scenario analysis, except instead of nuclear escalation or other kinds of escalation, we're talking about escalation in financial warfare. Another one quickly, Russia, Ukraine natural gas. As you know, Russia supplies the vast majority of the natural gas to Europe. If Russia turns off that natural gas, some parts of Europe will freeze in the dark. This is well known. Russia actually did that vis-a-vis Ukraine temporarily a couple years ago. Well, what if you were Russia, and what if it was your intention to shut off the natural gas to Europe for whatever reason? Well, you know you're going to do that. Why not go into the natural gas futures markets on the New York Mercantile Exchange and go long natural gas futures contracts? When you turn the tap off, we know the price of natural gas is going to go through the roof. They'll make a fortune on their futures contracts. So it's insider trading on your own information. And then are we looking for that? Are we looking at NYMEX futures, not from a trading point of view, but from a national security point of view? It's a field we call market intelligence or markint. There are ways of monitoring those markets to look for that. I mean, one of the problems is the U.S. government wasn't particularly good at figuring out Bernie Madoff. I don't know what they're going to do with Vladimir Putin, but I do know that the tools exist. They're actually used all the time. Hedge funds and Wall Street trading firms use these tools all the time, but they're not using them for national security purposes. They're using them to make money, which is fine, but the tools have other applications. Russia, Saudi Arabia, in terms of oil prices. Oil is a global market. There's a world price, but there are oil futures contracts also traded on the New York Mercantile Exchange. There's a practice known as painting the tape. Painting the tape is, it's just jargon for going in at the last, about 1 minute to close or 30 seconds to close, and putting in an off-market trade that gets executed that throws the market up or down significantly from the average price that day. Well, guess what? That's the price that gets reported in all the newspapers. When people go home at night after dinner, you know, NYMEX oil futures closed at this level. Well, you can push that level up a little bit with a very small amount of trading. You don't need to be bigger than the market. Everything happens at the margin, right? So you just need to have that marginal impact. That's the kind of price manipulation. Well, what if you did it 5 days in a row? It wouldn't even take a lot of money. What happens then is you now have a trend. There are all kinds of hedge funds out there that jump on trends. They're called trend followers. They do not do fundamental research. They do some, but what they really do is look for trends. Well, what if you're manipulating the market, creating the trend, all of a sudden hedge funds are piling on, all of a sudden the price of oil is going up on futures markets? That kind of thing could happen very readily. Again, are we looking for it? Are we analyzing it? And again, you don't have to be bigger than the market. You just have to be working at the margin to cause those kinds of distortions. I think we're well aware of the use of foreign capital, what I call state capitalism, to acquire technology in this country, and that's really the role of CFIUS, and the Defense Department has their own capabilities there, but they're active members in the CFIUS process, and we do scrutinize potential acquisitions by foreign countries of sensitive technology in the United States. That does not stop people from trying. It does not stop them from using complex structures, and I'm going to illustrate a few. Again, the forensic skills needed to unravel that, the kind of more lawyers and accountants rather than technicians and national security experts that you would need to examine those scenarios, I think, are critical. And finally, Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has said, one of the interesting things about an organization like that, it kind of reminds me of Mein Kampf. I mean, there's nothing that Hitler did in the 30s and 40s that he didn't tell us he was going to do in the 1920s. All you had to do was read his book, right? Same thing with Al-Qaeda. They've told us what they're going to do. They want to create a caliphate, and they have two primary goals. First one is mass casualties. Second one is economic damage to the United States. They believe that we don't have an appetite for either one of those things, casualties or economic damage, because we're kind of soft and we love our luxuries too much. In the first appearance of Osama bin Laden after 9/11, I believe it was at dinner near Kandahar that was tape recorded, and that videotape was later released. He knew chapter and verse about how much the New York Stock Exchange went down, how much wealth was lost. I mean, after he said, "Gee, this succeeded beyond our expectations," and guess what? They lost, X trillion dollars worth of wealth that day. He was very conversant in all those statistics, and again, they've said that's a goal of theirs. Now, am I predicting a terror attack? No, I don't have any particular insight as to when there might be a terror attack. But I do know that if you think of a weak economy as a force multiplier in a terror attack, this would be a good time to strike, because we're already kind of in a weakened state. Again, this patient with the flu that I described earlier. So is that an accelerant or a temptation? The possibilities there, given their stated goal of causing economic damage, this would be a good time to strike. And so that's the notion that the weak economy as a force multiplier is another intersection between financial economics and national security. Okay, with that, I want to run through a couple slides quickly. I promise these are all hopefully good graphic illustrations. I promise not to read bullet points, but I just want to go through a couple structures very quickly to show you how some of the kinds of manipulation and some of the kinds of proactive hedging that I just mentioned might be done. First of all, here's a list of things that our enemies might try to do. I think it's familiar to you: steal technology, information, delay projects. You can get into a company, and you could actually, if you can get management control of the company, you can cause them to fail to bid on certain contracts. Maybe the best bid or the best contractor doesn't come forward. Obviously, recruiting agents. A lot of times when foreign companies buy U.S. companies, one of the things they want to do are put in trainees. It sounds kind of innocent. These kind of 20-somethings come over, and they seem to have menial jobs. They could be trained agents, obviously, so trainees are a good way to penetrate an organization in the U.S. Disseminate disinformation, sleeper capacity. I mentioned various kinds of price manipulation and systemic market disruption. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But let's just go through a couple arrangements you might use. Here's one where it's managed a private equity management company, totally plain vanilla company in the United States. How are they structured? Well, they have an onshore fund and an offshore fund. For tax reasons, they combine their resources in a master fund. And then they invite in other partners. They manage the whole thing, put their own money in, but you have limited partners and foreign investors in those structures. Imagine a sovereign wealth fund out here, which wants to invest. They come in and invest in the offshore fund. But let's say there's a particular target company. Let's just say this target company, the size is greater, the market value is greater than the amount of resources of the private equity manager. So you set up a special purpose acquisition company, and then you set up a co-investment company. You're saying, well, if it's $1 billion deal and I can muster, say, $100 million, I want to go out and syndicate that other $900 million, so I set up a co-investment company. Well, who do you call when you've got your co-investment? You call your existing investors. One of the reasons people invest in private equity companies is so that they can get the first phone call when these special opportunities come along. So with a sovereign wealth fund owning a big piece of this fund, you're going to bring some other investors in, then you're going to bring the sovereign wealth fund into the co-investment vehicle, and then all the money ends up acquiring the target. Now, I promise I did not rack my brain to make up the structure. This is completely plain vanilla. I also promise you that actual real-world structures look a lot more complicated than this. But the point is here, economically, this sovereign wealth fund has a 32.2% stake in this target company, and yet if you were looking at the books of the U.S. management company, where would you see that? You wouldn't see it. You wouldn't even see it in the financial statements of the master fund. You'd have to get access to a lot of different statements from a lot of different sources to reverse engineer this puzzle. So there are ways of, again, using these structures to hide your tracks. And just to show this is a real-world example, a China sovereign wealth fund invested last summer $2.5 billion in TPG, Texas Pacific Group. By the way, just to be clear, this is probably a totally innocent transaction, right? China needs to diversify their assets. TPG is a highly reputable private equity manager. So I'm not suggesting anything nefarious going on. I'm just saying that the prior example is not a hypothetical. These types of structures are taking place every day. And my question, again, for the defense intelligence community is, what's our capability to look for the people who are bad actors? Another structure, I'll just go through this quickly. You have a target with some investors, a group of hedge funds, supposedly acting independently, but perhaps acting in concert, set up in various tax haven jurisdictions around the world by 15% each. Where did their money come from? Where did their money come from? It comes from their fund investors, but also something called side pockets, which are special purpose vehicles where some of the assets are segregated. Where did that money come from? Let's assume that you have Swiss, Austrian, Singapore, and Dubai banks, multiple of them which respectively invested in 4 different side pockets on 4 different hedge funds. Where do the banks get their money? Let's say they're holding it in trust for a couple trusts that would have totally innocuous names and called the Northern Hemisphere or Southern Hemisphere Trust. Who is the grantor? Where did the trust money come from? Let's put a sovereign wealth fund behind it. Now, imagine that this is nefarious. Imagine that this is a covert effort to get control of a company, and all you know is the target. And you're trying to work backwards through this maze to figure out who's behind it. Good luck going through the Caymans, going through the banks, going through the trusts, the lawyers, the accountants, the foreign counterparties, the tax haven jurisdictions, trying to do all this. Now, it can be done, but you need specialized resources, specialized forensic skills. You probably need agents in place. You need good collections. You need a lot of information, and you need to know how to use it. So here's an example of how legal structuring can be used to cover up their tracks. Now the U.S. isn't helpless here. We do have a lot of tools. We have CFIUS, you're familiar with, Export Administration Act. Our securities laws are available to us to require people to report. But remember, people want to break the laws or they're outside the U.S. jurisdiction. That can be problematic. Again, antitrust, tax, banking laws, our National Industrial Security Program, and IEPA, which are emergency powers from the president, can all be used to deter and thwart and investigate these types of efforts. So there are a lot of things on the books, but my question is, where is the coordinated, multilateral, multidisciplinary interagency process? Who on the CFIUS side, or who on the financial side, or who on the Treasury side is speaking to whom at the Pentagon or the intelligence community or elsewhere, coordinating this and putting a national security hat on. Again, I'll leave that question for your consideration, because I think it is a critical capability that we need. So just to summarize this set of, I'm sorry, I just had a couple more slides. You're all familiar with choke points. I don't know if there's any Navy in the room, but this is probably something every admiral goes to bed at night thinking about in his head. These are the oil choke points. Well, there are legal choke points around the world as well. There are lawyers, offshore directors. When you set up all these companies that I showed you, they all need boards of directors. They all need accountants. An administrator is kind of a bookkeeper for a firm. Brokers, you can't transact, you can't buy and sell in a vacuum. You need a counterparty, you need to go through a broker and a registrar, or somebody who keeps the share register. So there are a lot of what I'll call legal and accounting and administrative choke points where you can get information pertinent to these types of threats. And again, what is our capability to penetrate these choke points? Just leave that as a question. By the way, if, I don't know, I guess Bernie Madoff is the topic du jour, given the allegations, but he would have been an easy one to flag because he didn't have any outside directors. He had a no-name accounting firm. He's self-administered, and he acted as his own broker. So when you go down this list, every one of them would have produced a red flag for that, and that would have been a very obvious case to figure out that something might be amiss there. I'm talking about really the non-obvious case and getting inside these organizations to learn more. So just to summarize this part of the lecture, I'm not saying these threats are coming at us at 100 miles an hour. In fact, they're probably not. I am saying they're potential threats, and I am saying that circumstances can change so that non-threatening actors can become more adversarial and more threatening over time. And the question is, what is our ability to analyze these structures? What is our ability to penetrate the choke points? What is our counterintelligence function to look for this? And another thing I think that particularly the Department of Defense might think about are offensive capabilities. Again, the theme of this lecture so far has been threats, so we're sort of playing defense. But how can some of these things be used offensively against, say, preemptively, like against an adversary like Iran, or on a deterrent basis against China, where the message is, hey, China, don't go down that path of damaging our economy because there's a lot more we can do to you. Well, we know how those scenarios play out in military terms, in kinetic terms. What about financial and capital markets terms? Or even on a retaliatory basis for bad behavior by whether it's Russia or Venezuela or others. So these are all things, again, I leave with you in the specific threat category. Let me turn, I'm going to go through a lot of this stuff quickly, to what I call the meta threat. And the meta threat is the crisis that we're in today, the implications of that for U.S. national security in terms of the extent to which it might weaken the U.S. economy. And one of the things that people have been wrestling with is, what's the name for this? Is it recession? Well, officially we're in a recession. Is it worse than that? Is it a depression? Is it the Great Depression? Part two, nobody wants to use those phrases. I call it the Great Reckoning. It's a reckoning of debts that cannot be repaid. It's a reckoning of contracts that cannot be honored. And it's a reckoning of conduct that cannot be sustained. There's a lot of non-sustainable behavior that's going on really over a 20-year period. I would narrow it to the last 5 years. And that is all melting down in front of us through deleveraging, defaults, bankruptcies, failures, et cetera. And so I think that's the Great Reckoning is a good a phrase as any. My view of this, and again, we're going to go through why I come to this conclusion, is that we could be looking at perhaps a 20 to 25% decline in U.S. gross domestic product. I think the most pessimistic forecast you'll hear is, 2009 might be a really bad year, and it might go down 7 or 8% next year. That's at the far end of pessimism. I'm suggesting that you might see something like 6 or 7% for 3 to 4 years, not 1 year, that this could go well out to 2012. And if that's right, you are looking at something like a 25% decline in GDP, which would severely restrict resources. And it also could encourage adventurism and opportunism on the part of our rivals. And again, I think we think of Russia particularly in this context. Failed states, social disorder, scramble for resources, obviously food, energy, water, and gold. And I think this combination of severe depression, restricted resources, and increased threats and increased mission is one that will be particularly stressful for the Department of Defense, because I think that given the can-do attitude and the top-down structure and the ability of the Defense Department to be responsive, you'll be called on to perform a lot of tasks in a world where resources are going to be cut. So that's sort of that's kind of a takeaway tonight in terms of how we might be thinking about this on a going forward basis. Let me go through some of the dynamics here. I realize what I just said are fairly, if not extreme, they're fairly pessimistic predictions. I think it's irresponsible to posit something like that without going through a thorough analysis of how you get there. So let's just try to go through that, what I call the meta threat from the current financial crisis. Here's our old friend, the bell curve. You're all familiar with it from statistics and other kind of random studies. And if this were this is what's called a degree distribution, right? The vertical or the y-axis is the frequency of the event, and the x-axis is the magnitude of the event. And all it says is that innocuous events happen all the time, and extreme events happen very rarely. That's all it says, and that's what a degree distribution is. Now, if this were people's height, let's say the height of man, I just happen to know that off the top of my head. This is a 5'9" person. The 5'9" is the average height for men. And over here, you got somebody who's 5'10". Over here, somebody who's 5'8". Not unusual. Could you run into somebody who's 7 feet tall? Sure. I mean, I met Will Chamberlain when I was a kid. 7 foot tall person is kind of way out here. Could you meet somebody who's 4'2"? That's possible. That's kind of way over here, right? But are we ever going to meet anybody who's 10 feet tall? As far as science knows, in the history of the world, there's never been a 10-foot tall human being, and there's never been a 6-inch tall human being. In other words, those are here. Now, these are standard deviations. This is a statistical methodology. At 6 standard deviations, you are so close to the x-axis as to be practically impossible. Not theoretically impossible, but we're talking about events that would happen once since the Ice Age. So that's where you get to out here with a normal distribution. Now, what's been happening on Wall Street? What's been happening on Wall Street is that events using this methodology that would be 10 or 12 or 15 standard deviations. In other words, events that statistically should happen once, if at all, since the beginning of the universe, in 13 billion years, are happening every couple of years. The 1987 stock market crash, stock market declined 24% in a single day. Well, if you take daily fluctuations in the stock market and distribute them along this curve, and then you say, what does it mean to be down 25% in one day? That's a 10th standard deviation event. It's way off the graph. Same thing with the crash of the NASDAQ, same thing with what happened in 1998, same thing with the stock market performance after 9/11. These things aren't happening once every 100 years, let alone 10,000 years. They're happening once every 4 or 5 years. How many of you have turned on the TV, you're listening to CNBC, and somebody's saying, I can't believe what I'm seeing, this is the 100-year flood, or this is the perfect storm. I wish I had a nickel for every time somebody said perfect storm. Well, what they're expressing is they're expressing that they're using this methodology, and they can't believe what they're seeing because it's so far off the charts. To me, when you have a methodology and you have empirical observations that don't fit the paradigm, it tells me your paradigm's wrong. I don't say, gee, this is really weird. These things are happening every 5 years. They should never happen. It tells me you've got the wrong methodology, and that is, in fact, the case. There's more to it than this. Again, we don't have time to conduct an entire financial economics course, but this is the foundation, along with some embellishments, of all of the risk systems on Wall Street. There's something called value at risk, VAR. This is how they do it. Now, people recognize that these things are happening every couple of years, right? I noticed it, they noticed it. So they invented the fat tail. The fat tail is you take this part of the curve and you move it up a little bit. You move it up around there, and that explains these, what they call outliers. Well, if you have to put a fat tail on a normal distribution, is it a normal distribution? I think you know the answer. The answer is it isn't. You're fitting the curve to the data instead of taking the data and thinking hard, thinking analytically about what kind of system actually works. So with that, and it is scary how much of Wall Street risk management, how much of government regulation, how much of portfolio management, how much of investment allocation is based on a completely flawed paradigm. So where we are, it's kind of 1499, and Copernicus hasn't published his latest research yet. And scientific consensus is that the sun revolves around the Earth, because you wake up in the morning, it comes up over there, it goes down over there. People believed for 2,000 years before Copernicus that the sun revolved around the Earth. And Copernicus said, well, no, the Earth revolves around the sun. So it's not surprising that people can get locked into a failed paradigm. That's exactly what's happened on Wall Street. And it accounts for a lot of the failure that we're seeing. So let's go to the next stage. What is the new paradigm? What is the better way to analyze capital markets and therefore improve our ability to analyze threats from a national security point of view? And it's a nonlinear dynamics method. Now, interestingly, people in the military and in other scientific disciplines are very familiar with system dynamics, right? You build a F-16 is a very complicated system. People do it all the time. It combines science, physics, and engineering. Why don't we take a systems dynamics approach to capital markets and see if we can get better results than the paradigm I just showed you? What would that consist of? Well, a couple simple questions. Are capital markets a system? Mississippi River is a system. F-16 is a system. Well, the answer is yes, they're a system. Bernie Madoff ran a good old-fashioned Ponzi, allegedly. Why did it fail now? Ponzi's always fail eventually, but why now? Why not next year? Why not a year ago? Well, the answer is people actually needed the money. They're losing so much money in the financial crisis that they said, well, let's call Bernie and get some of that. I would rather leave it with Bernie. He's doing so well, but I'm losing money over here, so I'm going to call Bernie and get some of my money back. Of course, he didn't have it, and the scheme allegedly, the alleged scheme collapsed. Well, so those two are not unrelated. Even though his Ponzi had nothing to do with the financial crisis, they did impact each other, and that's what we mean by a system. It has a lot of complicated parts, and they come together in various ways. Once we say that, we have to ask, is it a static system or a dynamic system? The Eiffel Tower is a static system. It's a system, but it kind of sits there. Well, I think it's fairer to say we have a dynamic system, and again, I'll use the example I just gave as proof of that. And then it gets interesting. Is it a linear dynamic or a nonlinear dynamic? Linear dynamics, inputs produce outputs either one-to-one or it's some multiplier, but when you graph it, you get a straight line. Nonlinear dynamics is, input, nothing happens, input, nothing happens, input, boom, the whole world changes. That you get these exponential changes in outcome from infinitesimally, basically decimal truncations, infinitesimally small variations in initial conditions lead to these radically different outcomes. I want to submit that that is exactly the kind of system the financial markets are. And that's why we're seeing such bizarre behavior that people can't explain, like, why is this happening? We've never seen this before. Well, I was in Japan in the fall of '07, and that was when this crisis was just getting rolling. And people said, well, we understand you have a subprime crisis in the United States, but we don't understand why the Japanese stock market is going down day after day after day. What does that have to do with your subprime crisis? Well, the answer is that when you're in distress, you don't sell what you want, you sell what you can, right? You've got garbage assets and you've got good assets. You'd love to sell the garbage, but you can't. There's no market for it. So you sell the good stuff to get cash. Well, that's what was happening. The Japanese stock market was liquid. The subprime market was not. And so money managers who needed money were selling Japanese stocks to get cash to keep going. And this is an example of how these things cascade around the world. So I want to suggest that we are dealing with a nonlinear dynamic system, which can be not static, but stable within bounds. And again, I'm a little bit fascinated with the F-16. The F-16 was the first aircraft that was intentionally designed to be unstable. So it could do kind of enormous maneuverability and performance in stress situations. But it's stabilized with very complex computer systems and flaps and rudders and all kinds of things that kind of constantly tweak the flight path to keep it stable. But it's inherently unstable, and that's by design. Well, capital markets are the same way. They're inherently unstable, but a stability can be maintained through normal behavior, government regulation, a little bit of self-interest, et cetera. But when those things fail, when those systems fail, it just goes way off course. And that's the kind of situation we're facing today. We've moved from chaos, which actually can be somewhat regular and stable, through turbulence into complexity. And again, for those familiar with sort of fluid dynamics and hydrodynamics, there's a very familiar categories. It's unpredictably deterministic, no linear relationship between inputs and outputs, exponentially sensitive to initial conditions, and two other important features. The magnitude of events is exponentially proportional to the frequency, to the scale of the system, to the parametric scale of the system. So if you double the scale of the system, you don't double the risk. You increase it by 100 or maybe 1,000 times. And the other thing is these systems have emergent properties. Just take a human being. You know, you can boil it down to chemicals, right? There's a little sodium, calcium, oxygen, carbon. You know, it's a couple of dollars worth of chemicals. You can put those chemicals in a vat, pour in some water, jolt of electricity. You don't get a human being, even though you have all the constituent parts. Obviously, human beings have evolved in an extremely complex way that would be very difficult to replicate. But we have emergent properties, which is my ability to speak and your ability to comprehend what I'm saying. There's nothing in the chemical formula, there's nothing in the parts that said we should be able to interact in that way. Speech and cognition are emergent properties of these complex systems. I want to suggest that the financial markets are those types of complex systems, and they have completely unexpected emergent properties which are now playing out on a global scale. Let me just talk about the parametrics quickly. From 2002 to 2006, I stopped in 2006 because the crisis began in 2007. Over the last 4 years before the crisis, notional value of swap contracts went from 106 trillion to 531 trillion. The notional value of equity swaps, bets on stock market direction, went from 2.5 trillion to 11.9 trillion. Those are both factors of 5. Credit default swaps went from 2.2 trillion to 54.6 trillion. That's a factor of 25. Now, take what I just said about the exponential relationship. When you scale up by factors of 5 and 25, you're increasing the risk by factors of 1,000 or 10,000. And what we've done is we've scaled our system off the charts. So when that collapses, which it's in the process of doing, we should expect results that are far worse than we've seen, not in decades, but perhaps centuries. Now I think we can start to think rigorously and more scientifically about the capital markets within which we operate. And this is the degree distribution that works. Now this is a log-log plot, right? So this is a logarithmic scale, not a linear scale. If you do it on a linear scale, you get a curve. You get a different kind of curve. You don't have to fit the curve to the data. The curve fits perfectly. It does have a fat tail. It's well off the x-axis, which means that these extreme events do happen with some frequency. But when you plot it logarithmically, it's a straight line. It's called a power law. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Now, what I want to highlight is this parametric increase from line segment N1 to N2, right? That line segment A, that's the scaling I talked about. 5 times more equity swaps, 25 times more credit default swaps, et cetera. That's forcing you down that line. But look at what's happening to the risk. It's going from 10 squared to 10 to the 6. In other words, this is a factor of 1,000,000. Now, by the way, this is a new branch of research, so this is a theoretical construct. I don't want to suggest that all this has been normalized, because it hasn't. We need to do a lot more research as to exactly what those factors are. But the system does work in this exponential way. It is not bounded by history. That's the other thing I keep hearing is that, gee, this is worse than the 70s, or it's maybe worse than the 1930s, et cetera. And people who know about fat tails, people who know that things don't seem to be normally distributed, use what they call stress testing. So they take the 87 crash, the 2001 stock market crash, they take these other events, and they say, that's my worst case, just typical worst case scenarios, right? And they say, okay, I'm not only going to model my portfolio to the normal distribution, I'm going to model it to the stress test, and now I'll feel comfortable. But that is another breakdown in the paradigm, because the only limit to the catastrophe is the scale of the system itself. It is not bounded by history. Now, notice that the curve goes vertical there. What is that? Well, that truncation, that's the limit of the system, right? You cannot have a California earthquake bigger than the state of California. You cannot have a Colorado forest fire bigger than the state of Colorado. In other words, even with these exponential effects, these systems do have limits. But I don't take much comfort from that, because we're way off the charts in terms of where we've ever gone before. By the way, these systems exist all over the place. They're in, if you took earthquakes and took the Richter scale as your data and plotted that on this plot, those data points would be distributed right around that line that I'm showing. Forest fires, why does a lightning bolt sometimes cause a small fire and sometimes burns down half a state? It's the same lightning bolt, right? It's not a bigger lightning bolt, but you have these minute differences which expand exponentially and you get very different outcomes. Polarity, solar flares, the power grid, line falls, tree falls on a line, knocks out the power in the neighborhood. Next time it happens, the entire East Coast goes out. Why is that? Well, nobody knows, except that there are these very tiny differences in initial conditions. What we've done is we've scaled the financial system way beyond anything we've ever seen before. We've now had the tree fall on the power line. We now had the camper throw the match on the dry tinder. And we're now seeing results, and we should not be surprised that they are catastrophic in nature and far worse than we've ever seen before. I use the analogy of the dry tinder. Where did all this tinder come from? I'll go quickly. We have a lot of policy failures, and they go back over a long period of time. The repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, that law had been on the books since the 1930s. The Congress in the 30s weren't dopes, right? Maybe some people in 99 thought they were, but people in the 1930s had just lived through something like what we're living through now. And they said, let's see, commercial bankers originate crummy loans, securitize them, and sell them to their customers to make money. That's a really bad thing. So why don't we separate commercial and investment banking so banks can lend and investment bankers can underwrite, but you can't do both. Flash forward to 1999, and we recombined them. Well, what happened after banks and investment banks could get together? They originated crappy loans, pardon my language, they securitized them and sold them to their customers. In other words, the behavior was exactly the same we saw in the 1920s. Human nature didn't change, but we forgot the lessons of the 1930s, and Senator Graham notwithstanding, the people in the 30s were not dopes. They actually had better information than we do. Alan Greenspan fails to understand risk. He does not understand this dynamic system we just described, the exponential impact. Greenspan was a large advocate for not regulating derivatives, really let the genie out of the bottle, let the system expand exponentially. There are certain benefits to that. What Greenspan said over and over is, if I have some risk, if I have a quantum of risk, instead of putting it all in one place, why don't I slice it and dice it and pass it out to people in pieces who are better able to bear the risk? Well, you know what? That makes very good sense, and he's right. But what he didn't take into account is, what if we got so clever at that we drastically increased the quantum of risk? So the first order efficiencies of slicing and dicing are outweighed by the second order costs of the exponential increase in the scale of the system. So I think Greenspan was good at first order efficiencies and pretty bad at second order costs in terms of scaling. I think the Bush administration, their main failure, really sins of omission rather than commission. I think they had an ideological view of not interfering with markets. It's the difference between the umpire and the second baseman. Should the government suit up, put a hat on, grab a glove, go out and play second base in terms of the private economy? Absolutely not. I don't think for 1 minute that government officials can make better asset allocation decisions or business decisions than private individuals. But would the baseball team take the field without the umpire? The government's role is to be behind the plate calling balls and strikes. And I think the Bush administration failed to distinguish between the two roles, between the players and the umpires. Their idea of non-interference was to have no umpires. And the game pretty quickly degenerated into chaos, and that's what you're seeing today. Wall Street has its share of failures, including the flawed paradigm that I explained, and frankly, just greed. Current policy failures, Bernanke is started out operating on the wrong side of the balance sheet. Bernanke is the greatest living student of Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, who did the monetary history of the United States in the 1930s. Interestingly, Anna Schwartz is still alive. She's 93 years old. She gave an interview recently and said Bernanke's got it all wrong, kind of a bad student. Bernanke is like a general fighting the last war. He's fighting the 1930s. The problem in the 1930s, it wasn't the assets. It was the liabilities. There were runs on the banks. The job of the Fed was to lend freely to the banks, to give them liquidity on the liability side of the balance sheet. The Fed failed to do that in the 1930s, and we got the Great Depression. So along comes this crisis. Bernanke says, I know what to do. We're not going to have a replay of the 1930s. He floods the system with liquidity, The problem was we didn't really start out with a liability problem. We started out with an asset problem. He was on the wrong side of the balance sheet. So we did not do a good job of, still not doing a good job of getting those assets off the books. I think Paulson failed by putting capital into the banks instead of using it to buy the assets, which was the original intention of the TARP. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. I don't want to pick on Tim Geithner. He's our next Secretary of the Treasury, kind of example of the Peter Principle. He failed in his primary task. His primary task was to put up a clearinghouse for derivatives, get all these derivatives, put them in one place. A simple example, if I owe Duncan $100, and Duncan owes Brad $100, and Brad owes me $100, right? We have a very simple financial system. Well, the gross risk in that system is 300. But the net risk is 0, right? I pay Duncan, Duncan pays Brad, Brad pays me, we all get our money back, the risk goes to 0. That's what clearinghouses do. You put all the risk in one place, you net it out, and typically it doesn't go to 0, but it can be reduced 90%. Now, take the exponential impact that I described earlier. If you can descale the system by 90%, you can descale the risk by 99.9%. In other words, it is the single most important thing we need to do. We need to get these derivatives into a clearinghouse so they can be netted. Once you have netting, you can allow failure because you have transparency. You have good information. Instead of uncontrolled failure, you have controlled failure. We need failure because we've got to get the bad assets and the bad banks out of the system, get clean banks, and get them lending again. So there was the Treasury and the Fed are imitating, doing what I call the Jean-Paul Sartre policy, which is there's no exit. They've gone in, but they have nowhere to get out. A couple slides really quickly. This is the most important slide tonight. Here's the way investing actually works. So we have a high net worth individual, and the person says, I want to invest, but says to a banker, I want to invest very conservatively. So the banker says, that's fine. We'll leverage you 2 to 1 and give it to a Swiss fiduciary. Well, a Swiss fiduciary goes to his bank and leverages it 2 to 1, and he thinks that's conservative. Says, we'll put it in a fund of funds. They're really good at picking hedge funds. Hedge fund does the same thing. They leverage 3 to 1. The fund of funds puts it in a hedge fund. The hedge fund's a little sexier. They leverage 5 to 1, but they're out of good ideas, so they give it to a private equity fund that leverages 7 to 1. And this is the problem. It's not 3 to 1 or 5 to 1 or 7 to 1. It's the pyramid, which in this case approaches 2,000 to 1 leverage. So the next time you hear somebody saying, oh, gee, isn't it a shame that the banks went to 30 to 1, you can just kind of take a deep breath and say, you have no idea what you're talking about, because this is the problem, thousands to 1 because of the pyramid. And if you said, Jim, how do you unwind this? If the person at top wants her money back, how does she get it? The answer is she doesn't. You cannot unwind this. And this is exactly the situation we're seeing right now. Balance sheets are freezing up around the world because you cannot, hard enough to unwind 30 to 1. You cannot unwind anything like this at all. Here's the housing bubble, Case-Shiller index. Now look at that peak. Very typical of a bubble. The blue line is inflation-adjusted housing pricing index, so it's real. Now look at the period from 1990 to 1999. It was very flat. This thing took off around 96, 97. Now, we're off the top. Now, bubble behavior, we've seen many examples. Nikkei was 40,000 in 1989. It's about 9,000 today. It's 75% below its all-time peak 20 years after the peak. And that's the problem with bubbles. They don't go down a little and bounce back. They don't go down a little and level off. They go down a lot. They overshoot. They go below the long-term average, and they stay there for a while, and then they come back. So I would say that housing prices are probably going to go down another 50% from here. In other words, my expectation would be that that's going to end up somewhere down there and then level off a little bit. So you think we have a housing crisis now. Take housing prices. They're already down 25%. Take them down another 50%. That's typical bubble behavior. Our friends at the Fed did probably cross this. This is one of the most famous equations in monetary policy. M is the money supply. V is velocity. Velocity is just how often does the money turn over, right? So I go to the bar tonight and I leave a tip for the bartender. The bartender takes a taxi ride home, pays the taxi driver buys a Christmas present for his child. That money has velocity of 3. That dollar turned over 3 times. What if I take my money and put it in the bank? Velocity is 0. I'm not supporting any GDP with that money. So all this equation says is that you take the money supply times the velocity, and that equals Y, which is gross domestic product, times P, which is the price level. So PY together is real gross domestic product, or gross domestic product adjusted for inflation. Now, The theory was that V was constant. Milton Friedman did a lot of work and came to the conclusion that V was constant. So therefore, inflation and economic growth could be adjusted with the money supply. You increase the money supply, the other side of the equation is going to go up. Now, if the natural limit on growth in the economy is 3 or 4%, because you get 2% population growth and 2% productivity growth, and you increase M by 5%, when Y can only grow at 4%, there's only one other thing that can happen in that equation, which is P has to go up, which means you have inflation. And this was the whole monetary school of basically using money to control inflation. But it was all based on the idea that velocity was constant. Here's velocity over a 108-year period. Now notice the period from about 1953 to 1980. This is when Milton Friedman did all his work. Velocity actually was constant during his productive academic lifetime and was centered around the mean. But look where it got to in 1997. That looks like a bubble to me. And look where it got to in 1932 and 1946. If you take that velocity down to the level of 1932, that's a 35% decline from here. That means if you don't change anything else, or go back to that equation, you take velocity down 35%, your gross domestic product is going down 35%, unless something else changes. Well, what else could change? Well, what the Fed is doing is printing money like mad. They're trying to get the M up because the V is going down so they can prop up the Y in that equation. The question is, it's a foot race. It's in the United States economy and our national security at stake. If V drops faster than M can increase, then gross domestic product is going to go down significantly. And here's M. You wouldn't want this as your flight path. You're going vertical at the end. But this is what the Fed is doing to your money supply in a furious battle to offset the decline in velocity and the decline in gross domestic product. This is not a forecast. Okay? This is not a prediction, and this is not an investment advisory seminar. So don't go home tonight and sell your stocks and buy gold based on this slide. But this is data. If you take the money supply of the world, using these major economies, I left out Russia and Zimbabwe and places that don't have serious money supplies, but take the major economies and the European Central Bank and divide it by all the gold that's above ground, public and private. This is what you get, $3,900 an ounce to have totally gold-backed money. Why hasn't the dollar done worse? We're printing them like crazy. We have large trade deficits, large budget deficits, et cetera. Why hasn't the dollar done worse? Well, the answer is other countries have nowhere else to go. There aren't enough euros and there aren't enough yen to absorb the dollar savings of the world, so they have to go into dollars. But we're abusing the privilege by printing the money like crazy. And the question is, how long will it be before the world seeks an alternative? How long will it be before other countries start gravitating to something that more closely resembles gold money? So my kind of bottom line on the economy is we've done this to ourselves through misunderstanding of risk paradigms, lack of regulation, lack of really understanding the best policies, and in effect, pretty rapidly debasing our paper money. Now back to national security. I wanted to go through all that because I wanted to support my thesis that we are in a much worse economic state than you've heard elsewhere, and that by itself, that is the biggest single threat to national security. If we get around, Dow 5,000, S&P 500, housing prices down 50%, unemployment in the 15-20% range. If we think capital in the financial system is on a mark-to-market basis is close to zero, you run a few risks. One is the repudiation of paper money. Now, if Russia wants to launch a preemptive assault, they could do something like the following. They're a large gold power. They could take their gold, put it in a Swiss fiduciary, a Swiss bank, and create warehouse receipts, which is just a fancy name for money, and have those governed by English law. I mean, nobody trusts the Russians. The Russians haven't paid their debts since Prince Vladimir of Kiev. But you could create these warehouse receipts, deposit in Switzerland, backed up under English law. They would immediately be gold-backed money, which they could use to purchase oil or expand their own economy. That could cause a flight from the dollar. That would be a shot aimed right between the eyes of the US dollar, something that no one has been able to do in history. Because the last time, since the dollar went off the gold standard, there's been no threat to the dollar. But the question is, are we driving our rivals to that because we're printing so many dollars? What I would like to see the United States do is to be a little more proactive about that. Can we, in a kind of Bretton Woods too? I'm not, to necessarily go back on 100% gold standard, but think seriously about how we back up the money, act proactively. Let's not have ad hoc solutions with three, sleep-deprived cabinet secretaries working through the weekend. Let's kind of get out ahead of this one a little bit. This is all doom and gloom. No, I think there are a number of policy recommendations we could consider. I talked about the derivatives clearinghouse, which is an exponential reduction in risk. I talked about the need for failure so we can be left with sound institutions with clean balance sheets. We need to re-engage the sovereign wealth funds. Last December, the sovereign wealth funds rose to the rescue, right? China, Dubai, Singapore, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, and a few others bought 9.9% each of Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, and the other leading financial institutions. What happened next? They lost 70% of their money. Those stocks are all, or more. So those stocks are all down 70%. It's a major political issue in these countries. It's a major embarrassment. They're on strike. They have no interest in coming back into our financial system today. And they are the real money players in the world. They've got our money, and they're not leveraged. We need to get them back. So we need to get clean balance sheets, get the government to buy these assets so that clean banks can attract private capital, begin lending again, and begin to get the economy moving again. A couple other positives. For all this risk in the system, I'd rather be the United States than any of our rivals. I think they're all in worse shape. Maybe we can save that topic for another day. Another thing is we have what I would call a compromised immune system. In the 1340s, there were two banks in Florence, the Bardi and the Peruzzi. The Bardi and the Peruzzi were the Goldman Sachs and the J.P. Morgan of their day. They failed in the late 1340s. The Black Death came along a few years later. Some scholars estimate that because of the failure of those banks and the economic recession in Europe, declining nutrition, increased unemployment, that actually the body of Europe was weaker because of the economic decline that made them more vulnerable to the Black Death. So take the economic scenario I'm painting, combine it with other threats that you're well aware of, pandemic, climate change, infrastructure collapse, internet, cyber warfare, and so forth. Throw those on top of this economic collapse, and you get, again, an exponentially greater threat. Recommendations, again, I talked about the clearinghouse. I would recommend financial wargaming. I think people are thinking seriously about that. Analytic resources. There's PA Consulting up in Cambridge. Los Alamos has some capacity here. Santa Fe Institute, which works closely with Los Alamos, and I think my own firm, Omnis, where we're here in McLean's, who are in the neighborhood. These are the kinds of problems we're thinking about all the time. The Fed has lots of experts, but I think the problem is that they're not talking to each other. We're not using kind of interdisciplinary approaches. I'm sorry, I got a little off of my slides here, so let me get to the end. Great. But there are resources out there. I think that the key problem you're facing is increased threats, diminished resources, and a lack of cross-disciplinary thinking. And these are the things I would most strongly recommend. Thank you, and look forward to any questions.
Okay, for questions, we have three rules. The first rule is please use the microphone because, again, we do tape these sessions and we put them on the web. And Deb Ridings, who's over here in the white sweater, will come to you with a microphone after we point you out. The second rule is do state your name and your affiliation, where you're from. And the third rule is we know that a lot of people want to put their question in context. And we want you to do that, but we want you to limit that. In other words, what I don't want to create is a debate going on here. And with that, we'll start.
Richard Marquez, GAO. But based on your discussion linking financial efforts with national security and Bernanke's somewhat wrong take on what to do, does yesterday's rate change essentially amount to unilateral disarmament since it allows overseas investors and sovereign wealth funds to start diversifying under the cover that since the dollar's value is going down, they can start looking for those other opportunities, and we don't recognize that we're forfeiting some of our own leverage in some of these threats going forward if we're not being proactive in linking his decisions with national security ones?
Well, there's a clear linkage between lowering the interest rates, and what happened immediately was the dollar started to decline. And the stock market went up, at least went up for the day. I'm not sure what I think it was heading down today. And the important thing the Fed did yesterday, they said, we'll do whatever it takes. We're out of interest rate bullets. That gun is empty, but we'll do whatever it takes. What they meant by that was they'll go out and buy government securities. They'll go out and liquefy the market. And they can do that. They have an unlimited capacity to print money. But my point is, at what point have you printed so much money that nobody wants it anymore? One of the things the Fed is looking for, they're looking for the power to issue debt. They want to expand their own balance sheet by issuing a new kind of interest-bearing Federal Reserve debt. Well, I have some Federal Reserve debt in my pocket here. It's a $5 bill. It says Federal Reserve note right on top. Now, where I went to law school, a note was debt. It was a liability, right? But why would you issue interest-bearing liabilities when you already have the capacity to issue non-interest-bearing liabilities called paper money? Well, the answer is they're printing so much money that they want to be able to soak it up at some point. If these obligations are out there, they can sell them and reduce the money supply. Typically what they do is they sell treasuries, but they've got so much garbage on their balance sheet that they're running out of room for the treasuries. That's how kind of boxed in they are. We keep saying we don't want to repeat Japan in the 90s, but we keep doing it. What we're doing right now is we are repeating Japan in the 90s. We're not allowing failure. We're not cleaning up the banks. We're not getting rid of the assets. We're freezing the balance sheets. We're taking interest rates to zero. This is the Japan playbook, and it will have the same result. People talk about the lost decade. It's been the lost 2 decades. It's been 20 years since Japan has had essentially no growth. So I think we're following the Japanese policy. Unfortunately, we're setting ourselves up for a prolonged period of further decline followed by no growth. So I agree with the premise. I think they're on exactly the wrong track.
Hi, Tom Brasic, OSD Policy Planning. I guess since World War II, our economy shifted from being more of a manufacturing-based GNP. Now it's more, of course, service-oriented. And I guess the bad news we're seeing out of Detroit with the big three about ready to implode here without some kind of a bailout. Is that a bellwether sign, you think, for some of our defense industries, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Electric Boat? Are they going to be the next to topple if we don't get our arms around that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I'm not an expert in the automotive industry, but my understanding is the problems of the automotive industry in Detroit are largely self-inflicted because of the contracts they've got for themselves. We actually have a very prosperous and efficient auto industry in the United States. It's just not in Detroit. It's in places like Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi and so forth, the so-called implants. People always worry about, oh, gee, well, they're owned by the Japanese. Well, they're here. I mean, it's like they can't take them back to Japan. It's like when the Japanese bought Rockefeller Center, it never troubled me because I walked down Fifth Avenue and I said, well, Rockefeller Center is still here. In other words, that capital infrastructure is in the United States of America. It's productive, it's efficient, it's not going anywhere. So, and Boeing is world class. I mean, they can compete with anybody pretty much around the world. So I think that to answer your question, it is troubling, but I think it's a unique problem to Detroit and that sector of the industry. I think actually U.S. manufacturing and technology in a lot of ways is fairly robust. But maybe the vulnerability is in the supply chain. You say, well, where do you get your inputs? Where do you buy your parts? Or where do you send things for further processing? I think in globalized supply chains, we're more vulnerable to disruption. Sure.
Hi, I'm Sharon Jackson. I'm with Battelle Memorial Institute. I've read that part of the reason why we've had the problems that we have is because there were a bunch of theoretical mathematicians sitting in Wall Street coming up with these kind of debt instruments.
Right.
Is the state of theoretical math at the point where we could actually get out of this using it?
That is a really good question. I'll be brief. What happened on Wall Street? It had to do with kind of the descaling of the space program. I was in investment banks and hedge funds throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and we used to hire people from NASA because the space program was winding down, and We had people who worked on the Peacekeeper missile and so forth. And they had wonderful quantitative skills. They were astrophysicists, great mathematical skills. But here's what happened. They came into Wall Street with a lot of theoretical constructs in their head. And the Wall Street people, led by the economists, not by the physicists or the mathematicians, but by the economists, they said, here's how the world works, and we'd like you to write the equations and the models. And they said, okay. And they wrote all the equations and wrote the models. But the view of how the world worked was completely flawed. So they wrote good equations for a bad paradigm. When people keep saying the models are broken, I was like, no, the models work fine. Your worldview is completely wrong. And that was really the problem. The Wall Street gurus, the management, would have been better off talking to the physicists about power laws, about the kind of thing we explained tonight, and about dynamic systems analysis. So I do think, I feel strongly that theoretical physics can make a very powerful contribution to Wall Street and can help us with our problems, not by writing equations for a failed paradigm, but helping to teach Wall Street management and economists about a better paradigm that actually works. The problem is when you understand how it actually works, it's pretty scary because we didn't know it all along and we just scaled the system right off the charts. But it's a really good question.
Tim Johnson from Booz Allen Hamilton. My question has to do with financial products and their safety.
Right.
And I was reading recently about stock index funds and how they're different from just traditional equity investments where you funnel all of your funds into one particular industrial arena, say healthcare. When with the stock index fund, it crosses the stock market essentially.
Right.
So you have a large portfolio. The whole idea of a stock index fund is that it follows the dynamics of the economy. And it's supposed to be a lot safer. And it suggests that if you invest, say, $10,000 over the course of 16 years, your average yield would be at about $90,000.
Right.
Whereas if you do a traditional investment, your average yield would be about $49,000.
Right.
So since you had stated that we've reached the system limit, if you will, are those financial products no longer safe?
Well, based on my view of where this crisis is leading, I would not expect to see any growth in the stock market. In fact, I expect the stock market to go down further and then stay there. There's the word love, L-U-V, right? And a V is when it goes down sharply and bounces right back. A U is it goes down and pokes along on the bottom and then comes back. But an L is it goes down and it stays there. And I think we're in for an L where it's going to go down further from where it is. And look, there's always a bottom, right? You're not going to be able to buy General Electric for 5 cents a share. There's a bottom. We're going to find it. And if it's Dow 6,000 or Dow 5,000, I don't know. But there's a bottom, in my view, significantly lower from where we are today. The problem is when we get to, say, 5,000, it's not going to rally back to 14,000. It might stay at 5,000 or 6,000 for 7 or 8 years. And that's the history of bubbles. So I'm not saying in the long run, that there isn't some benefit in stocks, but we could be poking along the bottom for a very long period of time. I think the difference in the returns between the two products you described, the stock index fund and kind of going out and buying your own portfolio, is mostly in terms of costs. There are a lot of commission costs associated with picking and choosing stocks that you don't have if you buy the index, and that's one of the selling points of index products. Those costs can add up over time. But I'm really talking about something different, which is I'm not comparing the two products. I'm saying either one of them could be in for a very, very rough. It doesn't go to zero, but it goes down and stays there, and I don't think we're really prepared for that.
Hi, Sergio Rodriguera, OSD Policy, Solic. Sir, if looking at marketable debt, does it concern you that there's no mechanism in place for the Treasury Department to raise concern or raise flags if they're seeing activity from other reserve managers who are from not necessarily rogue nations, but other countries who are buying up our debt?
Right.
And is the Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis the right place to collect that information or gather that information? And also the other concerns that you mentioned, is that office robust enough to handle that?
Well, it troubles me a lot that we don't have the right kind of watch function. Let's just start there. Now, you're right. The Treasury watches markets all day long, and the Fed watches markets all day long, and the open market trading desk of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is a nerve center of market activity. So they're watching markets, but they're watching it for completely different reasons, right? They're watching it to assess the impact of monetary policy. They're watching it for various market disruptions. They're worried about a hedge fund failure, but they're not asking themselves, are these enemies? Are these rivals? Is this state action? What are these national security threats? So they're not focused on the right set of questions, at least not for that purpose, number one. The intelligence office that you refer to, they do great work. They really do, but it's much more in money and banking. It's kind of follow the money. I think, by the way, the United States has been very proactive and very forward in terms of following money around, interdicting, freezing accounts, identifying bad actors in the money system. But I'm not talking about money and banking. I'm talking about stocks, bonds, and derivatives. That's a different skill set and different markets. So I'm not sure that watch capability, A, is asking the right questions in terms of national security, although they are looking for market disruption, and B, whether they've gone beyond money and banking into actual capital markets. So these are, without knowing what's going on inside every government agency, I would say that these are capabilities that need to be more robust.
Hi, Ben Richter with Booz Allen Hamilton.
Ben.
You talked about how arguably the Treasury is going about helping banks from the wrong side of the balance sheet, focusing on liabilities rather than assets, buying up troubled assets and perhaps liquidating them. Could you comment on the other side of the equation, if you will, whether there is still really much demand for loans to be issued by banks, assuming that they had the ability? In other words, do consumers really desire and demand loans to buy houses and buy cars, or are we as a consumer economy kind of saturated on the demand side of the equation?
Right.
Thank you.
That's a really good question. Julius Caesar said that all of Gaul is divided into three parts. Well, all finance is divided into three parts. I mentioned assets and liabilities. The third one is the capital account. So your assets are over here, your liabilities are here, and you subtract your liabilities from your assets, and you get your capital. And frankly, everything else is gloss. All the derivative products, all the equations, all the fancy stuff is gloss on that basic relationship among assets, liabilities, and capital. Now, the Treasury and the Fed are both operating on the wrong side of the balance sheet in two different parts. The Fed's operating on the liability side. The Treasury is operating in the capital account by giving the banks capital. The problems are all over on the asset side. Now, remember, banks are heavily regulated, and they have asset to capital ratios. They cannot lend more than their capital will support. Now, right now, their balance sheets are frozen because they've got a lot of junk on them that they can't sell, and they only have a certain amount of capital. So their ability to expand those balance sheets is very limited. So how do you get out of that box? Well, the way you get out of the box is take the bad assets and literally put them under a rock. The Treasury should buy those assets, put them under a rock for 5 or 10 years, however long it takes. The Treasury doesn't have to mark to market. The Treasury doesn't have a capital ratio. They don't have all the constraints the banks have, so just bury it like radioactive waste or something. And then take the bank. Now the bank has a clean balance sheet, and guess what? A private investor, sovereign wealth fund, will actually want to put money into a clean bank, but they sure as heck don't want to put it into the banks we have today. So part answer to your question is the banks have a very restricted ability to lend because their balance sheets are frozen because we have not dealt with the bad asset problem. So I think there's a lending problem. There's also a borrowing problem, and that goes to the velocity slide I showed, and I think you're exactly right. Some of this is behavioral, and we didn't talk about behavioral economics tonight. I talked about nonlinear dynamics and more traditional financial economics. Behavioral economics plays a big role here. It's just don't underestimate the psychological aspect. People are saying, I kind of have too much stuff. I got 3 cars and 5 TVs, and do I need another flat screen TV? Do I really? And people are losing their jobs. They're seeing their 401ks are collapsing. Their home values are collapsing. How many Americans, go to bed at night and say, well, where's my retirement? It's in my 401k in my house. Those are down 20, 30, 40%, depending on where you live and what your portfolio looks like. So that's a shock. And people have never experienced anything like it before, so they stop spending. And even if you didn't lose your job, maybe your neighbor did, and you're worried about losing your job. So there's a reluctance to borrow that shows up in the velocity of money going way down very quickly. And there's an inability to lend because the balance sheets are frozen. So I think they're both problems, and this is going to, it's like slamming on the brakes at 60 miles an hour. That's what happened right around October 1st, and that's what's happening to our GDP. And that's why I call this the meta threat. Like, you don't have to worry about some specific country coming after us with some kind of financial attack. We've actually created a monster for ourselves.
Tom Barnett at IDA. Your comment about the Treasury buying the toxic assets. Can we figure out what those what those actually are? I mean, we've conflated the whole problem with derivatives on top of derivatives and structured investment vehicles and a series of names that I barely grasp.
Sure.
But at the basis of it, a lot of it was subprime mortgages. Mm-hmm. There is a piece of property that's hooked to that in some way. Is that what you're talking about buying ultimately, or are we going to offer what 40 cents on the dollar for some asset that's been created out of subprime mortgages, and then related to that, if you got down as far as the condos in Prince George County out there where they built them one right after another,
right.
What do you do with them?
Well, a couple of things. Part of it is, just subprime mortgages, but the bigger part of the problem, the part that's kind of got everybody scared, are the derivative products that came off of that. I mean, there were analysts, really smart guys like Ben Stein, who's an economist, lawyer, writes in the New York Times. Early in the crisis, throughout the fall of 07, early in 08, he kept saying, don't worry, I know it's bad, he said, but he did some back of the envelope math. He said, well, we got about, $1 trillion of these mortgages, and historically they've never done worse than like losing 5 or 6%, but let's just assume they're going to lose 20% or 30%, some radical assumption. So that's a $200 or $300 billion problem. Well, you know what, that's a big problem, but we can deal with that. We can deal with 200 or 300 billion. But the problem is it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And what Stein missed in that series of articles was that the derivatives were 50 times that. In other words, it wasn't about the $1 trillion worth of mortgages. It was about the 10 or 15 or 20 or $100 trillion worth of swaps and derivatives. That's what we can't put behind us. So when you talk about lifting bad assets from the banks, there are two parts to that. There are actual mortgages and securities and bad loans that you take off the balance sheet. But there's also the off-balance sheet. Now, on the off-balance sheet part, and you're quite right, there is no physical asset there. I have a contract with you. We say it's based on $100 million worth of so-called notional value, but all we're really doing is paying each other cash flows calculated on $100 million of notional. There's no actual underlying thing. The problem there is that if either one of us defaults, if I default, that could cause you to default, and you get into a whole cascade of failures. That's where the clearinghouse comes in. So we need two solutions. We need to buy the physical assets, or the ones that are actually in securities form, put them under a rock. And then we need to take the derivative assets, the notional assets, and put them in a clearinghouse. Now, I was involved in the setting up of what's called the Government Securities Clearing Corporation in the late 1980s. In the 1980s, we had the same problem in the repo market. These are repurchase agreements between banks, and Credit Suisse would do a trade with Goldman, and Goldman would do a trade with Morgan Stanley, and Morgan Stanley would do a Greenwich Capital, and Greenwich Capital would do a Credit Suisse. And it was all the same trade. It just went around in a circle, but nobody knew it. Nobody knew who all the other links in the chain were. And so when we said, okay, starting now there's a clearinghouse, you all have to report your positions, we're going to net them out, and you're only going to pay the net amounts at the end of the day. Like, I owe you 100, you owe me 90, so I'll just give you 10, and we'll call it even, right? What we found is that the risk was reduced by 90%. That's what happens when you put them in a clearinghouse. We need two solutions. Buy the bad assets and bury them, put the derivatives in a clearinghouse and net out the risk. And now failure is manageable. There'll still be failure, but it's contained and manageable, whereas now we have no transparency, and it does very quickly go out of control.
James McCall from OSD. I sort of want to go back to the threat issue. Up to this point, the U.S. has been a 72% consumer economy.
Right.
Up to this point.
Right.
And it's had a tremendous effect as a global growth driver, and also as part of the wealth transfers we've seen. What do you think is going to change here? Do you think that we're going to have a different set? What are we vulnerable to? Who are we vulnerable to now going forward? If it's not necessarily Russia putting its gold into a Swiss bank and
right.
doing the script and all. What what dynamic might change?
I think the dynamic is just a long, slow grind, and affecting everyone, affecting Russia, China. It's not necessarily them attacking us or them launching some weaponizing money, as they say. It's more the case that we're all in it together because of globalized capital markets. I mean, you couldn't have had a problem like this 20 years ago because the capital markets were separate. You know, the Italian stock exchange favored Italian companies. It was difficult to trade stocks if you were in the U.S., et cetera. That's all been set aside. We've taken away withholding taxes, capital controls. We've merged exchanges. We've got globalized capital markets. So we're completely interconnected. I mean, one analogy would be if I went into your town at night and I took out all the stop signs, right? You might wake up in the morning and drive to work and say, this is great. I'm making really good time today. You know, things seem to be moving along more quickly until, you know, somebody hits a school bus and kills a bunch of kids. In other words, stop signs are first-order inefficiency, but second-order benefits because they prevent those kind of train wrecks. We've made the markets so efficient that now that we're in a problem, it's a global problem. It's affecting everybody. So I think the greatest threat is that the global economy is just going to grind down year after year. We're in a liquidity trap. We're not going to be able to get out of it by printing money. There'll come a time when, Bernanke said, well, I'm not worried about printing all this money because if we have inflation, I'll just raise interest rates. Oh, really? Unemployment's 12%? You're going to raise interest rates? I don't think so. And so these are the kind of boxes or corners the Fed is painting itself into. Now, in that world, what happened the last time? World War II. In other words, the last time we had 9 years of this kind of economic performance, the world got to be a pretty stressful place. And so I guess what I worry about from a national security perspective, failed states, breakdown of civil order, adventurism, non-economic behavior. Again, in the intelligence community, one of the things you worry about the most is mirror imaging. You know, I'm a rational wealth maximizer, so you're going to be a rational wealth maximizer, but what if you're not?
Peter Scharfman, Miter Corporation.
Hi, Peter.
Getting back to the idea of clean balance sheets. A clean balance sheet presupposes that you have some notion of what the assets are worth.
Right.
But even apart from the derivatives and derivatives on derivatives and so forth, which might be dealt with by the clearinghouse, the market value of most of the assets depends on the overall economy.
Right.
It's not as if the bank had a stock of gold coins and you knew what the gold coins were worth, and if you just got rid of the toxic assets, there they would be with gold coins, and you're good. Short of the government simply nationalizing the banks, what possible chain of events could bring us to a point where it was clear, where the bank's own estimate of the value of its assets was credible to anybody else?
The answer is I don't care, and I don't mean to be glib. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that. One of the objections, when the Treasury got the TARP authority and they got the $700 billion, right? The way they sold it to Congress, they said, we're going to buy all these bad assets. Well, they never did that. But one of the reasons was they said, you know what? We don't know what these assets are worth. We don't trust the bank's valuation. We can't think of a good auction mechanism. They had all these fine economic minds working on reverse auctions and all these methodologies for valuing the assets, and they couldn't come up with a good one. The system was still bleeding, and finally they said, the heck with it, we'll just shoot some capital in. I don't care what they're worth. You should pay a lot more than they're worth. Look, they don't have a value. If they had a value, we wouldn't have a problem, right? If they had a value, the banks could trade them. There would be some market price, and we wouldn't have to do this in the first place. Everyone said, oh, well, no, the taxpayers are going to pay too much. Of course they're going to pay too much. The taxpayers are the only resource at the end of the day. The taxpayers are on the hook for this entire thing. And so it's not a question of spending taxpayer money. You're going to spend taxpayer money. The question is, are you going to do it efficiently or inefficiently? And one of the things about paying too much, I would have paid a very high price for the assets because that's a twofer. You get the bad asset off the book, and to the extent you're overpaying, you're putting capital into the bank. You're getting two good things at once. And the end game is to get a clean balance sheet so you can start lending again. You want to reboot the system. We actually did this very successfully in the early 90s. We had an S&L crisis. It wasn't as big as the crisis today, but at the time it seemed pretty big. And we created the Resolution Trust Corporation, the RTC. We went in and we shut down these institutions. The assets went over to the RTC. The liabilities went to good banks. If you were a depositor, you were made whole. Your liabilities moved over to a good bank. The new bank opened, all the banks opened on Monday morning. The deposits were good and the assets were buried. And we got out of that in 3 years. It took the Japanese 20 years. They're still not out of it. We got out of it in 3 years because we bit the bullet. We took our medicine and we rebooted, started lending again. And we had a very prosperous decade in the 90s. Now, why aren't we doing that now? So, yeah, I would say the valuation issue is a really tough issue, and I don't care. I would pay too much because it's another way to inject capital into the banks. And by the way, you ought to punish the stockholders. There shouldn't be a free ride for the stockholders. But the key thing is to get the banking system moving again, and we're failing to do that. And that's the threat.
Ben Richter with Booz Allen again. In view of the United States and a lot of other countries printing all this paper money, can we expect that at some time in the future there will be a period of hyperinflation?
That's a really good question. I think one way to think about it is you can have hyperinflation and deflation simultaneously. One of my favorite jazz songs was from the Montreux Jazz Festival, and the name of the song is Compared to What? You know, when you're trying to measure inflation, my answer is compared to what? What if the consumer price index goes down 1% a month for 6 or 7 or 8 straight months? So you're looking at kind of 8 or 9% annual deflation, but the price of gold goes to $2,000 an ounce. Now, what have you got? Now, domestically, in terms of a basket of goods and services, you have deflation, but measured in gold, you have inflation. And what if the dollar drops against the euro and the yen? So you can have kind of external hyperinflation against real assets or alternative assets and internal deflation against a basket of goods and services at the same time. It's a really hard question, by the way. And one, you look at the Weimar Republic, they sort of had hyperinflation followed very quickly by deflation. And the hyperinflation stage comes when you're just running the printing presses and you're showing up with a wheel. My father was in the occupation of China after World War II. He was in the Marines. And he said, we used to go down to the store with a wheelbarrow full of Chinese money and buy some milk or bread or whatever. That's obviously hyperinflationary. But of course, what happens next is it collapses, and then you have a deflationary phase where the purchasing power of real assets goes way up and the value of money goes way down. And so, so the answer is you can have both depending on whether you're using endogenous or exogenous metrics, and you can have both in very rapid succession as part of a collapse.
Okay, last question.
Tom Barnett again. I'm trying to get a sense of where this takes us in a national security perspective. It seems that everybody is in this boat together since the financial systems are all linked and we have capital flowing virtually frictionless. But the U.S. is spending a huge amount of money to fight 2 wars, support the forces out at the far edges of the empire, and then, of course, at home we're going to spend a huge amount of money to try and prop up the economy, both pushing money into the banks and then employing everybody who can show up at massive infrastructure building and that type of stuff.
Right.
You get the sense there's got to be some exhaustion point that being able to do this, or do we really have Bernanke and his printing press cranking away enough to hold us together?
Well, using the logarithmic plot, one of the things I said was in terms of the greatest catastrophe, you're not bounded by history because if you scale the system too large, you can have a larger failure. But I did not mean to dismiss in any way the role of history. I think it's actually our best guide. So the short answer is we don't know, but looking back at history, time and time again, no paper currency has really prevailed for very long. The U.S. had enormous success on a gold standard. And all I'm saying is I would like the United States to be thinking about these things a little bit proactively. I think we are all in it together, by the way. There are external threats, but maybe the greatest threat is that the whole system is grinding down. And And there are limits on how much paper money you can print. So it does, the stability of the system as a whole, as I said, I think is the greatest threat. I think it needs to be addressed seriously. We have some assets. We have 4,600 metric tons of gold in Fort Knox. That's real stuff. I mean, the difference between, say, the United States and Europe, we can back our stuff up. We do have a robust military. We do have land. I think we have 638 million acres at like $1,000 an acre. That would get you $638 billion something. You sell condos on Crater Lake or nice views and so forth. I mean, no, seriously, we have real assets, but are we deploying them? And do we get to a point where we print so much money that we have to? And that may be the solution. That may be, frankly, I think a Bretton Woods 2, a proactive Bretton Woods 2. Let's do it. Let's talk about a new world monetary system that works for everybody before we stumble into it or before we're responding on an ad hoc basis. Thank you all very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you.